Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to be sharing a chat with Katharine Schellman about her new book, Last Call at the Nightingale. Welcome, Katharine.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much for having me today.
My pleasure. I told Katharine earlier that I love mystery and I love jazz and I love the Roaring Twenties, and this was just such a wonderful package. Loved the book. Is there a particular reason you chose that era to set the book in?
Well, my first series, the Lily Adler Mysteries, is set in Regency England, so early 19th century. It's kind of like you take your favorite BBC or Netflix costume drama, but instead of marriage, everyone's worried about murder. So it's got a very specific vibe with you've sort of the proper society with the murder happening underneath. But it's all very upper class characters. So I wanted to try and write something that was dealing with a very different set of people. I wanted to try working class characters. I wanted to do something that was a little more modern, that was in the United States. And as soon as I sort of had those parameters in mind, the main character, Vivian, just sort of walked into my brain fully formed with this very forceful personality. And as soon as that happened, I knew she's got to live in the 1920s. That is where a person like that is placed in time. And the same thing happened with a few of the other characters too. So okay, we're writing a jazz age book. That's what we're doing this time.
I love it. For all of Vivian's strengths came her sister's timidness, maybe a little bit of shyness. Florence reminded me of something I heard growing up in the South, which was more used as that person knew their place. So Florence was the kind of person who didn't get out of her class. She thought she should be here. At least that was my interpretation. And her sister was just the opposite. Her sister was the risk taker, the one who went out and fought. Yet in all of that, Florence has a loving capacity to keep the home fires burning. She may complain about it, but it gave a wonderful two-dimensional, these characters were exact opposites, but they were so fun.
Well, the funny thing about that is, Vivian's obviously the main character, and she's the one who is, like you said, she's out there. She's the risk taker. She's ready to break the rules and go find a good time, even if she's not supposed to. And Florence is a little more timid. She's worried about, crossing those lines. She's worried about doing things she's not supposed to. And she might want things to be different in her life, but she's a little more of a homebody. She's more of a rule follower. And the funny thing writing it was, personality-wise, I'm more of a Florence. If we're doing a personality quiz, I would score Florence on there. I'm a little more of a homebody. I'm not, I'm going to go out and just break all these rules and have a good time. I'm maybe I'll go out a little bit, but then I'll go home and take a nap. So it was, I think, writing Florence, I really didn't want her to turn into a caricature of the disapproving older sister. But the fact that I had that very strong personal identity with her made her, I think, a little easier to write. But it also made Vivian very fun to write because the contrast was there. Okay, what would I not do in this situation? Vivian's going to do that.
Vivian would do that. I love it. And, you're right. Somebody has to pay the rent.
Right.
And it really comes down to something, and especially set in the 1920s, opportunities for women were so very limited, and they were so relegated to second, maybe even third class citizens that a Florence had to be there because someone had to make sure the rent was paid.
Right.
Vivian was trying to get through the glass ceiling, which was already really low, but she really wanted to do something. And she does something in the book, which is so fun because you go along for the ride with Vivian, and Vivian gives us a good ride.
Yes. and even she's not sure where she's going to end up at the end of it.
No, and her fluidity was so beautiful to read as well. It's just who she is. She enjoys women, she enjoys men, she enjoys going out with men, going out with women, and just enjoying all the way around. That was something that was very heartfelt. I never viewed Vivian as anything except solid, and I liked that.
I think she's a character who really knows who she is. She might not really know what's going to happen if she makes X choice versus Y choice. And, for a character who's her life is very precarious as a working class girl in New York in the 1920s. And Florence feels the same way. Like both of them, their lives are precarious and they react to that precarity very differently. Like Florence is really like, I've got to double down on being respectable. I've got to double down on doing my work and keeping my head down. Whereas Vivian has more of a, if everything's so precarious, why don't I just go out and do whatever and see what happens as a result? Like it could be good, it could be bad, but it probably won't end up any worse than things already are. And I think there's a degree to which both ways of handling that sort of difficult lifestyle are valid. Like you said, you need someone holding down the fort at home, but you also need someone who's willing to go out and take those risks and bust through that glass ceiling and see what happens on the other side.
That's very true. And I think it holds forth in life today as well. There is nothing wrong with being a homebody or being that person who's serious about life. There's also nothing wrong with that person who is, let's see where the chips fall. Right. I'll deal with it. And of course, when you have confidence, you can deal with it. Life gives us all kinds of possibilities, and your characters have chosen different possibilities. And it's not just the two sisters, because we see Bee's dreams of what she wants to do with life, and we see how that unfolds through the book. And of course, as I said earlier, jazz does play such a big part in my life. I'm a huge jazz collector of music. So it's like, I just love that. Yes. So I was like, I could just hear the band in the background.
I would always, before I was writing, I had like a little playlist of songs I would listen to sort of get myself in the right mood. So I name check a lot of songs in the book while they're at the Speakeasy at the Nightingale, just because the music from that era was just so fun, so fantastic. And the music was pushing a lot of boundaries too, in terms of what people were writing about, what they were singing about. There's, it reflects so many of those cultural moments that were happening then in terms of changing roles in society, and that sense of really, like, in the 1920s, I think everyone, like culturally all across the board, people had this sense of, let's just go out and see what happens, which was a real response, I think, emotionally to World War I having happened so recently. There was just this kind of collective trauma response almost of people saying, this was terrible. Let's just go out and have some fun and not worry about it because we don't know what's going to happen next.
That's true.
It led to a lot of very interesting cultural shifts and, great music and some weird things happening.
And it's so funny because we had, World War I was so horrific. And then comes along, Prohibition. And there are all these things to keep people separate. I mean, if you were well-to-do, there was plenty of booze forever. But if you were poor,
they stocked up before Prohibition went into effect. They just filled their basements with booze. And they're like, great, we're set.
It's like going, having grown up in North Carolina, it's like going to the liquor store on Saturday because it's closed on Sunday. Oh my goodness. So I loved Honor, and Honor is a character in and of herself, and she is such a delight. Did you enjoy writing her?
I loved writing her. She was so much fun because, like you said, she knows who she is and she just owns it across the board. She is never pretending to be someone else. She holds her cards real close to the chest. Like she does not tell everyone everything that's going on, and she's not necessarily always honest with everyone in her life, but she's never dishonest about who she is and the type of person that she is. but it was very interesting writing her, because you only see her in this book in the context of the Nightingale, which is this world she's created for herself and her customers that is so separate from sort of the daytime world. Like, everyone's leaving their daytime lives behind for a little bit and coming to this speakeasy where kind of anything goes. And it's this very, very free, very affirming environment for everyone there. But there's always that sense of, it's just here. You know, if we were out in our everyday lives, like, the rules apply there, even if they don't apply here. So it's very interesting writing Honor solely in that context, but having that sense of, okay, if you saw her in another context, her life would be very different. And you know, that's why she created this place. That's why she has this club and has her little world that she runs with an iron fist, because that's where she can be who she is. And that's where her customers can have that freedom too. So, and we just finished writing the second book. I just finished writing it. My editor has it right now. And you see Honor sort of outside of the context of the Nightingale a little bit. So you get a little more into that. Okay, what does it mean to be, you know, this very, very out, very confident lesbian woman in the 1920s, not necessarily in this safe space that you've created for yourself.
Well, and she is a businesswoman in this book, first and foremost, and she's a very good businesswoman. She doesn't take her responsibility lightly. She takes it very responsibly, and that's a nice thing to read. You know, one of the things that we so often think in American society is that gay rights only came about in the 60s with Stonewall. Thank goodness for Stonewall. But there was an enormous culture in the 1920s where gays, lesbians, bisexuals, it didn't matter. They had spaces. They may not have been out on the street, but they had spaces that they could go to and feel safe. Of course, you might get raided. That was always the case, but hell, they raided gay bars into the 1990s. So it ain't anything new.
Right. They really created a lot of those safe spaces for their community, especially in cities like New York City. If you went to Greenwich Village, like, you knew that essentially every speakeasy you could find was basically a gay bar by like modern standards. Like that, they had, those communities were 100% in existence. And it was a very deliberate cultural movement in those communities to create safe spaces and to explore those identities and give people a chance, you know, to be themselves in that context. And there was a lot of not open cultural acceptance, because there certainly wasn't open cultural acceptance of queer communities, but it was part of that, you know, we're all doing a few illegal things anyway. One of my favorite things I found when I was researching was in the 1920s, there would be these giant hotel ballroom events that they called civic and masquerade balls. And they were essentially giant drag balls. That had thousands of people in attendance, and it would be people from the queer community, but also people who were just there to have a good time. And they weren't queer, they didn't consider themselves part of the community, but it was the fun social event that was happening that weekend, so people would turn up. And
that's right.
It's just, you know, those communities were there. I think they were underground in a way that they were not later in the 20th century, when a lot of those communities said, like, no, we're going to
be out and proud.
We're going to be out and proud. We're going to be part of the public community, not just the private one. But I think those private communities really laid that groundwork.
I agree. So a strange question, I think, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's suddenly strange in my mind. So honor and silence, is there a play on words there, so to speak? Was it intentional, or is it just in my mind?
I mean, a little bit, yeah. I think that there is, you know, there's a real sense at the Nightingale that everyone's keeping each other's secrets, and everyone has to. There's an implicit understanding that if you are here, you are on board. Like, you are not talking once you get home.
Right.
So that sense, like the names are not I think they weren't initially deliberate, but after I named them, I was like, oh yeah, that might have been subconscious.
Good. It's not just me. Okay, I'm good with that then. I, of course, was cheering for Leo the whole way. I mean, just so everyone knows, there are men in this book as well. So, of course, Danny is so delicious and so wonderful and such an integral part. He's like almost like a little bit of glue that holds the group together. He certainly is on board. And then I did enjoy Leo very much as well.
I think there's a degree to which with every character, you're like, oh, here's the ways in which you're a good decision, and here's the ways in which you're a bad decision. And I wanted everyone to have that vibe, because I mean, Leo and Danny, I loved writing them because in so many ways they're such sweet characters. Like they've got a lot of earnestness and a lot of just really deep understanding of their world and the people in their world. And like you said, Danny in a lot of ways holds the Nightingale together because Honor is running a business, but Danny is sort of the bridge between her and the customers.
Yes.
And he's the public face in a lot of ways of the Nightingale. But they also, they both have that edge. They live in this world of crime and speakeasies and mobsters, and you can't be 100% sweet and easygoing. You're just living a life where everything is a little bit of a crime.
Yes, I think that's very, very true. And I think that's that cohesiveness is one of the things that really resonated with me. You feel like, I mean, there are lots of twists and turns. So, and I do like that so very much. You get to peel the onion layer on all of the characters. You see different sides of them. You see, like you say, the strengths and the weaknesses of these characters, and it's enjoyable to watch how it unfolds. And and at the core, it's still a mystery, and because somebody gets killed, and we got to figure out who done it. And so,
there is a who done it there.
I mean, some guy has to go get himself dead, and then all of a sudden we have a story. So, but you did such a wonderful job with it. I so enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. I tend to be, when I'm writing, I start with characters. Like that's always really the place where I begin the story, and then who those characters are and how they interact with their world really drives the plot forward. So I want there to be a good mystery. I want it to be a good time. I want it to be fun to follow along with the characters and try to solve it maybe a little bit before they do, and see if you can guess those twists before they're coming. That's at least what I love about mysteries, is I love trying to get there at least a little bit before the characters do.
I enjoyed it very much, and as I told you when we chatted before we started recording, that there were some places that I thought it was going one way and it went somewhere different, and it wasn't one of those that, oh shucks, really, you tricked me. It's not that at all. It's just that the story is moving along, and their characters, we get to see more of the character to realize who they are, what they mean to the plot. And that was very enjoyable for me because it kept me interested.
I'm so glad, because for me, I'm the same way when I'm reading. I will be along for the plot ride, but the reason I really ever stick out a book is because I get invested in the characters. So I wanted there to be, I want these to be people that you really ended up, caring about while you were reading, and sort of being interested to see like, oh, what am I going to find out about them next? Because there's clearly something beneath the surface here that's hasn't been revealed.
I agree. And I think that one of the wonderful things you did, another wonderful thing you did with your characters I would love to see them again. I would love to hear where they go. And they have a lot invested in this book. And so you're like, okay, they could go together separately or whatever, but they're interesting enough. I want to see more about them. So I'm looking forward to the next one.
Oh, good. It's funny because while I was writing it, it was while my first book, The Body in the Garden, was what we call on submission. So basically we were seeing if a publisher would buy it, which was one of the reasons I wanted to write something completely different. Like I needed a break from that original series that I'd been working on while I was waiting to see if it would sell. So while I was writing it, it was totally just my own thing. Like I need something different. I'm going to write this. And I hadn't intended for it to be part of a series. It was just supposed to be a standalone book. And, these characters that I was having a lot of fun spending time with. And then, it wrapped up and their story was done. Not like there's a sense that their story continues, but in their own world. I was not planning on writing a second book. But then when my agent and I were taking this one out to publishers to see if anyone would buy this one, she said, "What would you think about pitching it as a series? Like, if a publisher wants to buy it as a series, would you be open to that?" So, of course I said yes, because
no, I just pass. I pass. I don't want to do that.
But then I had to sit down and figure out, okay, if we're writing another one, what happens? Because I hadn't had that in mind at all when I was writing it. So it was so much fun to go back to these characters and sort of see what they'd been up to and what bad decisions they were going to make.
Well, I love it. This book is called Last Call. I never figure out where it goes. Last Call at the Nightingale. It is so wonderful. It just came out this month in June. So I'm very excited for you, Katharine. It was such a wonderful read, and I'm already looking forward to the next one. Hurry up.
Next summer, it'll be here.
Yay, I love it. Oh, do you have social media or a website you'd like to share?
Yes, absolutely. You can find me at my website, KatharineSchellman.com. I'm mostly on Twitter and Instagram in terms of social media as @KatharineWrites, but you can also find me on Facebook and Goodreads, where it's just Katharine Schellman.
Perfect. Thank you so much for chatting with me, Katharine, and I hope you the very best of success.
Thank you so much, Dan. It was an absolute pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you. Hang on for me just a minute. Thank you for joining me with Out with Dan, and see you soon. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.